Chapter 14. No more mourning, crying, or pain before her NDE. The concept of God as a loving father made no sense to Crystal. Why didn't he protect her at age 3 when the sexual abuse began? Why did he let other men abuse her continually if he loved her? Why would he allow all the pain and suffering and chaos from her father leaving, an abusive stepfather, and a partying mother who left her with questionable company? By age 9, doubts about God's love or existence had a stranglehold, but something about Jesus sounded different to young Crystal. Everything I heard about Jesus made him more and more attractive to me. For one thing, he was human. Plus, he died on a cross for our sins. He died trying to save me. After a while I felt like I loved Jesus, and I wanted to get closer to him. So when I was 9 years old, I told my mom I wanted to be baptized. I remember thinking, that's what I want to be clean. And sure enough, I felt clean. I felt like my soul had been scrubbed. To this day, I can remember that feeling, after baptism, and how magical it was. But unfortunately, the feeling didn't last because the abuse continued. I assumed salvation meant being saved from all the crud that was happening to me. I didn't realize it meant Jesus was saving my soul. As Crystal entered her teen years, all that shame, hurt, and anger felt like her identity. When her mom got back together with her abusive stepfather, she acted out of the lies of that identity. If my mom didn't care enough about me to choose me over a violent ex-husband, then I certainly wasn't going to care about myself either. The sense of self-hatred that had been seeping into my soul was taking over. I blamed myself for all the bad things that had happened. I began to believe I was worthless, and I decided if I wasn't worth anything, I was going to act that way. At age 16, she got involved with a 22-year-old man and started partying. She and her mom fought constantly, until finally her mom kicked her out. Crystal lived in her car for months, and then her dad rescued her. Later that year, she unsuccessfully tried to kill herself. She got pregnant at 17. She had the baby. 2 years later, she got pregnant again and this time had an abortion. She felt unforgivable. She had affairs with married men and broke up marriages. She married a guy who had a worse past than she did. They had 2 kids, but then divorced when his constant drunkenness and drug abuse turned him abusive. Several years later, a guy Crystal was dating came to take JP, her 6-year-old son, for a ride on his motorcycle. Crystal said no, but when she went inside to check on another child, he took JP riding anyway. He crashed into a truck and almost killed her son. JP survived being thrown from a motorcycle and wedged into a truck's wheel well, but not without brainstem damage that required 4 months of inpatient therapy. As if that weren't enough, at age 33, Crystal went to the hospital for pancreatitis. Due to complications, she died for 9 minutes and found herself in heaven. I was instantly aware of 2 beings in front of me and to my left, and I knew right away who they were. They were angels. But they weren't just any angels, they were my angels. I recognized them immediately. There was so much brightness coming off them that I couldn't make out any features. But they weren't shapeless blobs, they definitely had a form, which was roughly that of a human body, long and slender. The being on the right appeared a bit bigger than the one on the left. A great, sweeping love for my angels overwhelmed me. It was like they were the best friends I could ever have, as if they had been by my side for every tear I ever cried, every decision I had ever made, every day I ever felt lonely. I understood why they were there, to greet me upon my arrival and guide me back home. Everything we were, everything that mattered, was passing freely between my angels and me. There was no room whatsoever for secrets or shame or misunderstanding or anything negative. There was just this wonderful, beautiful, nourishing sense of knowing. I was also aware of a being on my right, and instantly I knew who this was, too. And what overcame me was a profound, endless desire to praise and worship this being, for I knew immediately I was in the presence of God. I have always referred to God as a him, and I guess I always will. But the being on my right was not a him or a her, it was just God. Nor did I make any distinction between God, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit, as we sometimes do on earth. They were all one, the one before me now. There was no distinct form, certainly no face or body, just a blinding profusion of brightness. I wasn't so much meeting God as I was recognizing him. I already knew him, and he knew me. I'd spent my life doubting his existence and disbelieving his love for me, but in that instant I knew God had always been there, right there with me. There was another sensation, a sensation that I wasn't just aware of God, I was feeling him. His radiance wasn't simply something I could observe, it was something that overwhelmed every sense I had. In heaven we don't have just 5 senses, we have a ton of senses. That is what I experienced in the presence of God, a beautiful new way of receiving and sending love. I was completely infused by God's brightness and His love, and I wanted to enter into His brightness and intertwine myself completely with it. I felt a miraculous closeness to God but wanted to feel even closer. This was the Creator of the universe, and I was in His presence. The sheer ecstasy of it. The beauty of it, the joy and the grace, the way my spirit soared and my heart burst, how I wish I had the words to convey just how miraculous this was. It was the blessing of all blessings. In the very same instant that I saw and knew and recognized God, I immediately confessed that He was my Lord and worshipped Him with all my might. The Bible has a passage that says, "Every tongue will confess and every knee shall bow," and let me tell you, that's what this was like. A complete surrender to His greatness and an overpowering desire to praise and worship Him. On earth, there were times during worship in church when my feet hurt or my kids were fussing, and I'd think, are we almost done? But this was different, very different. With every fiber of my existence I wanted to praise and worship God, and that's all I wanted to do. And I wanted to do it forever. What drove my praise was the intensity and immensity of my love for God. There is simply no other love remotely like it. When I was in His presence, I just had the feeling that I loved Him so much, more than I ever thought was possible. And you know, back on earth, I had so many questions for God. If I ever meet Him, I'd say, I'm going to ask Him how He could let someone molest me when I was a child. How could He abide brutality against children or the suffering of starving people or cruelty toward the weak? In His presence I absolutely understood that in every way God's plan is perfect. Sheer, utter perfection. Does that mean I can now explain how a child being murdered fits into God's plan? No. I understood it in heaven, but we aren't meant to have that kind of understanding here on earth. All I can tell you is that I know God's plan is perfect. In His radiance, it all makes perfect sense. In this way all the questions I had for God were answered without me even having to ask them. And yet, standing in His glorious presence, filled with His infinite wisdom, there was still one question I felt compelled to ask. But in fact it wasn't really a question for God at all. It was a question for myself. Why didn't I do more for you? Why didn't I accomplish more in your name? Why didn't I talk more about you? Why didn't I do what you asked me to do? It's not that I felt regret. Regret is a negative emotion, and there is nothing negative in heaven. It's that I loved God so immensely I felt like He deserved so much more from me. Point 1 God suffers with us. That single statement can profoundly change how you view suffering. Even though God has a plan that will one day make perfect sense when we know fully, even as we are fully known, 1 Corinthians 13 verse 12, that doesn't make it feel better now. Yet God is not indifferent when this cruel, evil world stabs us with pain. David said, "You keep track of all my sorrows. You have collected all my tears in your bottle. You have recorded each one in your book." Psalm 56 verse 8 NLT. God keeps records because all our loss and sufferings will one day be restored in heaven. Job went through horrific suffering, lost everything, all 10 of his children were killed. He had all kinds of questions he demanded to ask of God, but when he saw God, he too had no questions. Like Crystal, seeing God somehow answers everything. But God said He would restore all Job lost twofold. As Steve Stroop pointed out, Job got twice the sheep and cattle and possessions, but only had 10 more children. In heaven, though, he will have 20. Nothing is lost when heaven is your destination. 2 When we suffer, God suffers with us. In all their suffering He also suffered, and He personally rescued them. In His love and mercy He redeemed them, Isaiah 63 verse 9 NLT. Paul was persecuting Christians, yet Jesus asked him, "Why are you persecuting me?" Jesus feels our pain. He tells us on the final day God will say, "I was hungry, and you fed me. I was thirsty, and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me into your home." When? They will ask. When you did it to one of the least of these my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. Matthew 25 verses 35 and 40 NLT. God enters into our suffering with us in a very personal way, and even though He allows it for a time, He does so for a purpose. I will never forget that horrible, high-pitched squeal. I was sitting on the couch as I watched from the corner of my eye. My 5-year-old daughter was passing through a doorway on my wife's shoulders, grabbed the frame, and toppled backward headfirst onto tile. It was excruciating hearing her in pain as I ran and held her. At the hospital, they had to inject dye into her veins to do a CT scan. It really hurt her, and I hurt with her. But I'll never forget how it felt when they said they'd need to inject her again. The doctors feared she might be bleeding under the skull and told us that if pressure built up it could kill our little girl. My daughter fought and screamed for them not to hurt her again with the needle in order to inject the dye. The doctor looked at me and said, "Dad, you have to hold her down." As I held her down, Ashley looked into my eyes, crying and pleading, "Daddy, don't let them hurt me." "No, stop them, Daddy. Why are you doing this to me, Daddy? They're hurting me." She was crying, I was crying, and it killed me to look into her pleading eyes knowing I could stop the doctors, but for her long-term safety, she had to go through this. If I didn't allow this temporary suffering, it could mean something much worse. But I suffered too. Maybe that's how God suffers with us. He knows this is necessary for a while, because he knows of greater dangers, but it doesn't mean it's easy for him. The only way he can allow it is he already knows and simultaneously experiences the joy of the day when he will remove it forever. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Look! God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death or mourning or crying or pain, for the old order of things has passed away." He who was seated on the throne said, "I am making everything new." Revelation 21 verses 3-5. God enters our suffering to lead us through it to the other side. Markers still playing with action figures on the floor, Colton Burpo showed his dad a plastic horse. He asked his dad if he knew that Jesus had a horse. After answering a couple questions that Todd asked, Colton made a curious comment, "Jesus has markers." Todd asked if, by markers, he meant the kind Colton colored with. Colton said, "Yeah, like colors." He had colors on him. When asked what color, he answered, "Red, Daddy." Jesus has red markers on him. Todd felt overwhelmed with emotion as he suddenly understood what Colton was trying to say. He asked Colton where Jesus's markers were. Colton stood up, pointed to both hands, then at the tops of his feet. "That's where Jesus' markers are, Daddy." 3. Jesus came as God's suffering servant, Isaiah 53, to overcome evil, pain, suffering, and death one willing person at a time, and he still has the markers to prove it. When Jesus' disciples saw him after the resurrection, Thomas was not present. Filled with doubt, Thomas said, "I will not believe unless I stick my hands in the nail holes." The next week Jesus appeared and he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." John 20 verses 27-29. Apparently, Jesus' markers remain a permanent reminder that he loved us enough to enter our suffering and redeem it. As Gary stood before Jesus during his NDE, he noticed where nails had been driven into his hands, not his palms as some paintings depict, but into his wrists. For probably where palm and wrist meet to bear the weight. It's hard to fathom the cruelty of humanity, and even more difficult to imagine how Jesus could say as they pounded the nails through his flesh and sinew, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Luke 23 verse 34. Richard, a Jewish man who believed in Jesus, died in an auto accident and claimed he observed light coming out of the nail holes. Jesus held out his hands in front of me, and I saw the nail scars. The wounds were open, shining with a beautiful light. 5. David foresaw what Jesus would suffer, describing a vision of Messiah's crucifixion 1,000 years beforehand, before crucifixion was even invented. "All my bones are out of joint. My heart is turned to wax, it is melted within me. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me, a pack of villains encircles me, they pierce my hands and my feet. All the ends of the earth will remember and turn to the Lord, and all the families of the nations will bow down before him." Psalm 22 verses 14-16, 27, italics mine. This is how God would bless all nations just as he promised to Abraham. He would become the suffering servant who, like a judo master, takes the hardest punch evil can throw and turns it into the greatest good. Jesus proudly wears his scars of love in heaven for a reason. We need to remember. Why suffering? But why suffer at all? If he is God, why not just create a world that bypasses all mourning, crying, pain, and suffering? I've come to believe this world and its suffering is necessary. In order to accomplish God's goal for humanity, to love God and love each other as His family forever, we must start from the knowledge of good and evil. See Genesis 2 verses 16 to 17. Why? Because love must be free. The freedom to choose or reject God's leadership is necessary for love. Imagine if a rich and powerful man fell in love with a beautiful woman, and he longed for her to fall in love with him. He could shower her with good gifts, and she may decide she wants more of the goodies he can provide, but will that mean she loves him for who he is? No. Maybe his prestige and power give her access to the finest luxuries that make her want to be with him, but does that mean she loves him for who he is? No. And what if no amount of good gifts or reputation could win her heart, and he got so desperate, he kidnapped her and put a gun to her head, trying to force her to love him? Can love be forced? No. Love cannot be bought, coerced, or forced. It must be freely chosen. Love that is not free to choose is not love at all. For God to create an eternally loving family, God chose to create creatures who can choose freely to reject Him and thwart His love. His good gifts, His prestige, His power can't force our love. We must be free to choose. It's risky business, because free-willed creatures who turn from God and thwart His love hurt each other. And when we get hurt, we often blame God and turn from the one who can heal us. Then hurting people hurt people, and evil propagates from person to person, all of us feeling justified. Fork in the road. I was 16 and on the floor in my room in horrible agony. If there really was a God and He loved me, why had He let my father die? Downstairs I could hear the post-funeral gathering, but I couldn't be with them. I'd just lost my father, my rock, my best friend. I needed to think. It felt like I'd hit a fork in the road, and this choice felt heavy. Part of me wanted to curse God and just live life however I wanted. After all, if He didn't care about me, why should I care about Him? But then another thought pushed through my pain. If there's no God, there's no hope anything good will ever come from this pain. Life sucks, then you die. If I trust what Scripture says, that God does love me, maybe one day He will make it right. My choice that day felt pivotal in my life. God never took away the pain, but as I cried out to Him in trust from my bedroom floor, I felt a peace and had a new thought. Okay, you'll have to be my father now. Years later I read, "A father to the fatherless is God in His holy dwelling," Psalm 68 verse 5. I now know who put that thought in my head. Jesus told His followers the night before His crucifixion, "I have told you these things, so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. But take heart. I have overcome the world," John 16 verse 33, italics mine. God never promises us a pain-free, trouble-free life. We live in a world where most of us pursue our will and ways more than God's will and ways. When we choose to go our own way, we create ripples of pain, hurt, and suffering that reverberate through humanity and down the generations. Much human suffering is caused by humankind's own choices. But we can overcome evil through Him, and He promises something good will come from our sufferings in the end. During his NDE, Dr. Alexander felt he understood the reason suffering and evil exist. Evil was necessary because without it free will was impossible, and without free will there could be no growth, no forward movement, no chance for us to become what God longed for us to be. That evil could occasionally have the upper hand was known and allowed by the Creator as a necessary consequence of giving the gift of free will to beings like us. But free will comes at the cost of a loss or falling away from His love and acceptance. Point 6 Pains of birth. God promises to overcome evil one willing heart at a time. And when we turn back to Him, He will even make something good of all our suffering, yet what we suffer now is nothing compared to the glory He will reveal to us later. For all creation is waiting eagerly for that future day when God will reveal who His children really are. Against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. But with eager hope, the creation looks forward to the day when it will join God's children in glorious freedom from death and decay. For we know that all creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time. God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to His purpose for them. Romans 8 verses 18 to 22, 28 NLT, all of life is a birth canal into eternal life. One day all creation will come alive with God's life. It's what NDers notice. But for now, earth is mixed with the knowledge of good, God's good gifts wooing us to Him, alongside the pain, death, and decay of the knowledge of evil, constantly warning us that something's wrong. God doesn't want us to think we are okay without Him and miss the whole purpose of our existence, to choose God so we might live with Him forever. And when we make that choice, He wants us to grow in faithfulness so He can trust us with eternal rewards and responsibilities. Professor Howard Stone recalls during his NDE, in my conversation with Jesus and the angels, they told me, God knows everything that will happen and, more important, God knows everything that could happen. From one moment to the next, God is aware of every possible variable of every event and each outcome. God doesn't control or dictate the outcome of every event, which would be a violation of God's creation. Every living creature has its own will that must be expressed. The outcome will always serve God's ultimate purpose, no matter how long or how impossible it appears to us. Point 7 That's why Jesus taught us to pray, Your will be done, Father, on earth as it is in heaven, Matthew 6 verse 10. God's individual will for us is not always done on earth, or He wouldn't have us pray for it. But God's ultimate will can be accomplished whether we choose His individual will or not. But why does God remain so hidden? It seems if we could see God, then we could better choose God. But even seeing God does not eradicate our need to walk in faith. Captain Black reflects how confusing it was to realize this. I had clearly seen heaven and was so changed by the experience. Why did I fail again and again to be the man I truly wanted to be? Why did I fail often to be a reflection of what I had seen and heard and learned? I guess seeing heaven didn't change the fact that I'm human. 8 Life is all about learning to love God and trust Him while we can't see Him, because then we will forever choose to love and follow Him throughout eternity when we can see Him. That's why we don't see Him face to face now. But why not just create free-willed creatures who do see Him? He did. Understanding their story helps make sense of ours.